to Perspectives, coming to you from the Marina Bay Financial Center here in Singapore. Today we put the spotlight on China-US relations. Now, for much of the past decade, America's attention and resources were focused on the Middle East. In the wake of 9/11, money and manpower were fixed on addressing the threats of terrorism and proliferation. But in recent years, the US has turned its focus to the Asia-Pacific to find China well on the rise. The competition between the two powers is expected to define the 21st century. Asia stands to benefit from healthy competition between the two, but the rivalry also brings uncertainty to the region. How should we in Asia view the China-US relationship? Well, joining me to get some answers to this question today are Professor Wang Gangwu, Chairman of the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore; Ambassador Chan Heng-chi, former Singapore ambassador to the US, currently ambassador at large with the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs; Ambassador Riaz Khan, former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan; and Professor Aaron Friedberg from the Departments of Politics and International Affairs, Princeton University. Welcome, all of you. Now, I want to kick off with the China-Japan sort of territorial disputes. I mean, they've really, at the moment, thrown into focus US-China relations and how they're sparring with each other. Now, the US says that it's not taking any sides. It's also refrained from actually responding to the potential of Chinese aggression. The Chinese, meanwhile, are pushing the envelope. What do we make of this current dynamic? I mean, how do we read this? Professor Friedberg.
I think it's part of a larger effort on the part of China to assert in a more forceful way claims that it has had for some time to territory and resources, not only in the South China Sea, but also in the East China Sea, where it's encountering Japan. From the point of view of the United States, as you mentioned, the official American position is that we don't take a stand on these territorial disputes as such, but we do support peaceful resolution of all these outstanding differences. As regards Japan and also the Philippines, of course, the United States has treaty relationships with these countries, and if they were to become involved in conflicts with other parties, the United States would have to consider coming to their aid. Of course, we hope that that doesn't happen.
Right. Well, the U.S. has been saying, and Leon Panetta, has been saying recently, the U.S. Defense Secretary, he's been saying that essentially this is not a policy of containment. What we're seeing here is not containment of old. So what is it really? I mean, the U.S. is planning to shift about 60% of its warships to the Asia-Pacific region. China, meanwhile, is ramping up its military capabilities, and then both sides are saying essentially that, they're not in some sort of geopolitical strategic rivalry. Is anyone buying that, Professor Chan?
Well, it is a fact that since the end of the Cold War and the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now recently with also the weakening of the Eurozone, China is the only peer rival to the United States. So there is this element of competition. Throughout the years, the decades, there's always been this question. Is China a strategic partner? Is it a strategic adversary? Is it a strategic competitor? Of course they are competitors, But the competition need not lead to conflict. It could be friendly. You could be near conflict, but you can always resolve it. So I think what you are seeing is, in fact, what comes naturally. You have a rising power, there's an established power. The rising power is seen to be challenging the order, whether they do it, willfully or not. And the established power will sense that the distance is closing and feel a little more, anxious. So both sides have to find a way of working things together. The point is that actually, Aaron, I would say U.S.-China relations has been, in fact, rather predictable and stable. You can see it from administration to administration. When there is a crisis, they somehow work it out. And my concern right now is whether we're entering into a new phase where the cooperative elements in the relationship is outweighed by the conflictual elements. And so in this sense, both sides have to really work out what they are going to do to build trust and to find a way to sort out the issues between them.
What do y'all think? I mean, are the cooperative elements outweighing the competitive elements at this point? I mean, we know that the dynamic has been pretty typical, you know, as Professor Chan has been saying for many decades now. But are we seeing a rise in the noise level? Are we seeing this noise level go up because the U.S. has decided to turn its attention to the region and rebalance things here?
I suppose that's something that the Chinese are weighing very carefully, because they've been very comfortable to have the United States busy elsewhere, and to find them back in, they have to recalculate how this return of the United States, or active involvement of the US in the region, how would affect their own plans. I don't think they know yet. I think they're feeling their way, and I think everybody is feeling their way. I suppose it takes several months, maybe years, before we can sort out how the new arrangements might make people comfortable again.
Ambassador Khan, what do you think?
Well, this competition and cooperation paradigm, this is something that has emerged in the post-Cold War era. And basically, as long as it's a benign kind of competition, it is fine. And this benign competition one can see in terms of trade, in terms of investment, in terms of fiscal policies, etc. There are problems and frictions, but they are manageable. There is a US presence in Asia Pacific, Japan, Korea, and China has not raised any objections to that. But now there is the question of escalation because of the disputes. So we have to see where is it going to lead to. What would be the objective or goals which can be achieved. Now, my own view is that if United States escalates its military presence, it is not going to lead to any solutions. The solution basically lies in diplomacy by the regional states, particularly those ASEAN states which are not parties to the dispute. So the United States has to be careful in raising the ante, so to say, and China itself has to be very careful also, because this region has emerged as a engine of growth, global growth, which is almost similar in size as European Union and the North Americas. And if there is confrontation, military confrontation and conflict, then no country in this region is going to benefit from that.
I think that's a very important point about the Chinese having been very comfortable with developing economic relations and concentrating on economic development and generally making itself very useful, very profitable and beneficial for all the neighboring countries. So by focusing on the economic side, in a way they've not paid too much attention on political and military security aspects of it themselves. So I think they're a little bit unsure how much they should move away and pay less attention to the economic side and pay much more attention to something that they're not very happy with. I think they much rather develop the economic side and use their economic power, their newfound power, to increase their influence through economic investments and drawing people into the trading network and so on. I think that's what makes them comfortable. Anything else, I think they're really not sure yet.
You know, the United States has been in the region, the presence has been here for quite a while. The refocusing, you know, it's wrong to say that they've left the region or they've not been here. They've been here, and you know, there's the alliances, treaty alliances are healthy, you know, and they build new defense friends, and there has been a commercial and economic presence. But there was a sense that, you know, in the time when they were distracted in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, China had been building up its goodwill and its presence and its influence in the region. So there was a talk of pivot, which is now is a word not used, and rebalance is a word. But this rebalancing has focused on military rebalancing, not enough of economic rebalancing, investment, educational ties, cultural ties. And that, of course, has somehow changed the chemistry in the region. And this coming at a time when there are assertive nationalisms, countries in the region feel, you know, they're about to arrive or having arrived, and each one is trying to make a stake also of a claim before, you know, a big power makes more claims. Then you find this rising nationalism, the noise, the clashes, the disputes, and you started, I think, by referring to the Japan-China conflict. Mm-hmm. I think it may be correct to say, Gang Wu, I think you focus on this much more, but it really started with a drunken sailor, or maybe not so drunken sailor, ramming against the Japanese boat, and the Japanese decided to take the unusual route of taking him to court, then a Japanese court, which indicates to the Chinese, and I guess if you read read this in a fine way, it is an expression of sovereignty. So it deepened the clash and so sharpened it, and things flowed from there.
Yeah. So, I mean, I get it. I'm hearing everybody, and basically the consensus seems to be that, the U.S. basically is trying to up its ante sort of militarily. China, meanwhile, has been sort of building up financial muscle. Are we going to see both sides now competing more on each other's turf? Aaron?
I want to dissent a little bit from this consensus. First, to agree with my friend, the ambassador, the notion that the United States was gone from Asia and has suddenly returned is simply wrong. We've had long-standing treaty relationships going back to the end of the Second World War, and other close relationships with partners like Singapore that go back to the 1990s.
Yeah, but you must admit that they've been very distracted by what's been going on in the Mideast. I mean, having to deal with now the pullout from Afghanistan, Iraq, etc.
That's certainly true, but it's an exaggeration to say that there is a dramatic shift in American policy. The United States has, for the last half century and more, focused a great deal of its strategic energy and attention and economic attention on this part of the world. That's point number one. Point number two, it isn't simply the case that China has developed economically and sought to expand its influence through economic means. It's also been engaged in a major, sustained, and broad-based buildup of its military capabilities now over 2 decades, spending between 15 and 17% GDP, adding 15 to 17% to its military budgets every year since the 1990s. So there's been a substantial increase in China's military capabilities, first. And secondly, I think many people in this region would say also that in the last several years there's been an increase in the assertiveness of Chinese behavior, statements and behavior in its dealings with its neighbors. The ambassador mentioned the incident with the drunken fishing boat captain, and it's true the Japanese chose to handle that initially in a way that could have been interpreted as front to China, but it's also the case that the Chinese government chose to escalate that incident to very high levels and didn't have to do that, and it did it for its own reasons, and China in its statements and its behavior towards virtually all of the countries in the region, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, all the way around to India, has taken a pretty tough stance in the last couple of years. So it isn't that the United States is coming in now all of a sudden and rocking the boat. I think there have been changes here that originate elsewhere.
Understood. Okay, let's hold that thought for the moment, because we have to go for a break at the moment. Granted, both sides seem to be escalating things a little bit right now, to say the least. We'll see whether a full-out confrontation is even a remote possibility. Do join us after the break. Welcome back to the special edition of Perspectives, coming to you from the Marina Bay Financial Center here in Singapore. Now, let's just pick up from our earlier point. Now that both sides, both China and US, seem to be stepping up and at least, raising the noise levels, the question is whether or not this is really going to translate into anything more dangerous or sinister. I mean, are we ever going to see any sort of outright confrontation, as it were?
My sense, having been in Washington for 16 years and talking to many people, is that the United States wants a good relationship with China. I believe the Chinese want a good relationship with the United States too. Why should they go into conflict or war? Each has its own domestic problems. The Chinese have internal development. They've got their problems. And the United States wants to repair its economy. They really have to prepare to step up into being a more competitive economy. And both sides are going through their transitions. China is going through a leadership transition. The United States is going through an election. So my sense is that that will put some break to any careening to a conflict. They will try their best to pull back and not really get into a conflict. The disputes we find in Asia, Japan, Korea, South China Sea, I don't think the United States or China want to be dragged into a conflict with each other by disputes started by other countries. They will choose their own battles. So I don't think this is the timing. My own sense, too, is that there's too much tied up and integrated in the two relationships. That both sides have a lot to lose. And whilst they will find things to fight over, they really don't want to get into a war with each other.
So even if that is not a possibility at this time, I mean, could we say that one party does have an upper hand here? I mean, it's often been said that China's relationship with its Asian neighbors is one of a client-state relationship. And really, I mean, can't we say the same of the Chinese-U.S. relationship, given the amount of money which the U.S. actually owes China to start with? Professor?
Well, the United States is not a client state of China, nor vice versa. I think, just to echo the point the ambassador made earlier, if there is a conflict in this region in the near term between the United States and China, it will not be the result of direct confrontation between the two out of the blue. It would be something that would be started as the result of a conflict between China and a third party, whether it's the Philippines, Vietnam, or Japan. So the United States is somewhat removed, but might be drawn into conflict. I think.
Do you want to be?
Absolutely not. No, of course not.
But but the question is, how much can the U.S. actually maneuver strategically and economically? We know that, it owes so much money to the Chinese to begin with. So isn't it sort of held hostage in a way?
I think, first of all, there are very powerful factors which will weigh in against any kind of conflict situation evolving direct conflict between China and United States. There is interdependency, there is huge economic interest. There is also cooperation now in very important areas, including even in the Middle East. The two powers are cooperating in the Security Council. So if at all, like Professor has mentioned, if there is a conflict situation, it would be something like the Cold War tensions and proxy wars, where the United States would be pulled into a situation on behalf of one party or the other. But then it is for the regional powers to see how will it impact on the region itself, and will it lead to any solutions, which I don't see that there would be a possibility. Now here we know that China is not a global military power. It has not thrown a military challenge to United States anywhere. But here there are issues of sovereignty which are involved. China has addressed issues of sovereignty in case of Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan in a very deft manner. Is it possible to address the issue of sovereignty in the same way, even on an interim basis? Can we segregate the issues of sovereignty from, say, use of natural resources in the area? So here is a challenge for diplomacy.
Yes, but I mean, isn't the challenge also, Professor Wang, also the fact that, the sovereignty issue, I mean, is China also going to use its financial clout to press for more sovereignty over the region, which is exactly what seems to be signaling, the Chinese policymakers seem to be signaling?
It is probably unrealistic to keep on postponing the sovereignty issue, but that's what the Chinese have been saying all along, because they don't know how to deal with it and they don't see any easy way of solving it. They want to keep putting it aside and concentrate on economic and other ways of dealing with the neighborhood. But I think the issue is that for the smaller countries, the sovereignty issue is much more important to them whether it's the Philippines or Vietnam, these issues are more urgent for them. For China, it's not urgent, so they can afford to wait. But smaller countries get really uneasy about leaving it too long. So and this is the question mark is quite a tricky one, is where the small countries feel that maybe they can get the United States to come in, it could help them make their case to push the Chinese to deal with the sovereignty issue, even when the Chinese keep on trying to pass the buck and push it away.
That's often said that, whether or not the U.S. presence here is going to be a stabilizing or have a stabilizing effect, or is it really going to embolden some of its allies?
It may not be the United States taking the initiative. It's other people who say, well, since the United States is around, let's get the U.S. to help us on this, that, or the other. And this is what I think people fear. It's hard to calculate. I think the Chinese are also very worried, just to see the Americans back in the way they see it. And then other people taking advantage of that to sort of draw the Americans in and to put the Chinese, as it were, on the defensive might be something that the Chinese are afraid of. That I think is of some concern.
Yeah.
I think it's also true, though, that the other countries of the region, by virtue of their relative size, if they were compelled to confront China on their own to resolve these outstanding disputes, would be at a great disadvantage. And for that reason, I think there are many in the region who want to make sure that the United States remains a visible and forceful presence because they don't want to be left alone with an increasingly powerful and influential China. If the United States were not present in the region in the way that it is, China would be able to impose solutions to these problems according to its own desires and without necessarily making reference to the interests of others.
Sure.
I have a slightly different take on this.
Yes, Ambassador Chan, you first.
Can I say something on this? I think it was Gang Wu who said that some of the countries in the region may want the United States to come in and lend a hand to try to find a solution, have a word with China, to talk about the dispute, which is what I think Panetta was trying to do. And the president to-be, Mr. Xi Jinping, did say that, China did not want the United States to intervene in the situation. Nonetheless, I think with the United States coming in, talking to their allies, after all, the United States told Korea and Japan to, look, try to cool it, not so good for the region. And then going to have a word with Japan and then having a word with China, something is happening. A lot of this diplomacy is really, done on the quiet. It's quiet diplomacy. It's a shuttle diplomacy. It's leaders talking to each other. So something is happening. On the issue about the United States coming to this sort of military clash with China, where others were talking and I couldn't intervene, I want to point out that also on this visit, I read with interest that Panetta said that the U.S. Navy is going to invite China to join RIMPAC, which is the largest international maritime exercise, covering the countries of the rim of the Pacific, but it includes countries like Netherlands, France, Russia, inviting China to join, to send a ship. Now, that's interesting. So what I would conclude, looking at what is happening, is that, frankly, I think there's a certain maturity in the U.S.-China relationship. There are some things they don't agree on, some things they fight about, but they can compartmentalize the different issues.
Okay.
And doing that helps so that the issues in one area do not spill over and tarnish, and infect others, so you get a big blow up.
We got to take a pause here. We got to go to break, unfortunately, but let's come back and let's talk about how the neighborhood is reacting to both the U.S. and China. Stay with us on Perspectives. Welcome back to the special edition of Perspectives. We're coming to you from the Marina Bay Financial Center. Now, let's pick up with Ambassador Khan now. We were talking about how the neighborhood is actually responding and reacting and sort of shifting its positions, given this sort of also evolving U.S.-China relationship. It's been said that typically, you know, given a choice, you know, the countries here in Asia wouldn't want to actually choose between U.S. and China. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. They should not be choosing, but because there is already an equilibrium which has been established in terms of economic relationship, investments, trade, etc. And this is working for the benefit of the entire region. Now, basically, we are talking about this conflict situation and the U.S. involvement into the region in a military sense. The problem is here, I think the Chinese themselves would be very sensitive and concerned about the possibility of such military involvement on the part of U.S. on behalf of some of these countries. So that would be the pressure on China itself to move towards some kind of a solution. But if United States gets involved, then we have seen the behavior of major powers. Sometimes they take a more strident position in that situation.
Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, I mean, as a bloc, I mean, in ASEAN, we know also that, you know, both sides are trying to court nations in this region, and they're courting countries very hard. Now, I guess the question is, will this lead to a situation where the ASEAN region or the ASEAN bloc as a whole is going to lose a lot of credibility because, you know, it's going to be split down the line, or, you know, it's going to be split in its decisions as to how to respond to both these powers?
I think this is actually a matter of some concern, because so much has been built up about ASEAN's potential for bringing people together and gathering all the neighboring countries into a very peaceful mode, that if there's any doubt about ASEAN's credibility as a unit, as capable of speaking with one voice, capable of agreeing among themselves, if there's any doubt about that, I think other powers will then get drawn in. And I think this is part of, in a way, is a responsibility of the ASEAN countries. I'm very concerned by the fact that some of the ASEAN countries are not actually trying hard enough to make the ASEAN really work together. And internal difficulties there, if they're not really worked out carefully, could actually harm the whole region and lose its capacity. And I think that would be a great pity.
So what united ASEAN, an ASEAN that's cohesive, that together can do things, is in the interest of both the United States and China.
I guess, but I mean, looking at just the recent, you know, Chinese-Japan territorial disputes, I mean, ASEAN came out to say that, you know, it's taking a neutral position on the issue. But really, is anyone paying heed? Is China paying heed at all? I mean, the U.S. might welcome that, but really, does China care?
Well, I think they may care less now than they did 10 years ago, in part because their power has grown. I agree that a unified ASEAN playing a strong role attempting to resolve outstanding disputes would be something that's in the interest of the region as a whole. I think it's certainly, from an American perspective, something that's desirable. I'm not as sure that the Chinese welcome it now. I think as their power has grown, they would prefer, to the extent that they can, to deal bilaterally with the various member countries, again, because in that situation, they are overwhelmingly powerful.
Actually, I don't think that's quite right, because I think they do want to settle or deal with the sovereignty issue, disputed areas, bilaterally.
Yes.
But I think they are very concerned for the unity of ASEAN. My understanding is that they understand their interest lies in a united ASEAN. It's not just between ASEAN and China. It's because if ASEAN is united, all the other powers are also neutralized to some extent.
Yes, I mean, I think that is an ideal situation, but is that really going to translate on the ground? I mean, obviously, I think there are lots of countries, as Ambassador was saying, which might actually make use of this rivalry, that it might be a boon to them, because then they can be leveraging and maybe using the rivalry as some sort of bargaining tool to get what they want on an individual basis.
It's not really a question of boon but I think there is a role for some of those ASEAN countries who are not parties to these disputes. They can play a role. China being a major power, one can understand from the behavior of major powers in similar situations that they would be resisting a pressure from a bloc or from a big power from outside. So that is why insistence on this the bilateral.
Sure.
But then it doesn't inhibit other countries who are not parties to it to engage in quiet diplomacy, as Ambassador Chan has said.
I would not be so cynical, or blasé about, so ASEAN issues a statement, who cares? Of course they care. Can you imagine if our statement came out to say that, country X was wrong and country Y was right? That would have a very different coloration. So a neutral statement is important. But also, I think both China and Japan in this case, they care about the region. They care what we think. And we have our own issues too, our disputes, territorial disputes. So what stance we maintain matters, because you then carry the credibility to pronounce on your own issues. If you take some other stand, and when it comes to your South China Sea area, then why would anyone believe you,
Okay.
if you take a different stance
Sure.
in Northeast Asia.
So let me put this to you then. So what kind of U.S.-China relationship would best suit countries in Southeast Asia, you think?
Oh, clearly one where they are both working very well with each other, because it affects the entire context. A good U.S.-China relationship, in fact, creates an ambience in the region. And everyone is confident, they will trade with each other. You don't have to choose sides. You're not afraid an embargo is going to happen anytime soon, anywhere. So really, it's good for the region when there's peace between the two great powers.
On that point, I would say that it's terribly important then that all 10 countries of ASEAN all agree that they want good relations between US and China. And stick to that at all costs. That would be very helpful.
Yes, that said, I think there are a lot of people who also believe that, when it comes down to the crunch, a lot of people, a lot of countries in this region would probably opt for China. China has been building up a lot of, economic and sort of investments here in the region. It's one of the biggest trading partners for the region. When it comes down to the wire, they're going to opt for China.
It depends on what you mean, the crunch and opting for China. I think most countries in the region quite rationally want to have the best possible relations with both the United States and China. It's true that as China's economy has grown, it's become increasingly important for all of the countries in the region. At the same time, many, not all, of the countries in this part of the world and also in Northeast Asia have, just as they've been deepening their economic relationship with China, they've sought to bolster their strategic relationship and also their economic relationship with the United States. They don't want to have to choose, but they want to maintain good relations with the U.S. even as they deepen their economic relations with China, and that makes perfectly good sense.
Regardless of these alignments, the rule of the thumb is that if in a region political disputes they flare up, it constricts economic development and economic growth.
And everyone, you would assume, would be responding rationally. And that would keep everyone in check. Do you think that it will be that simple, though?
I also think we have to probably clearly distinguish between what is happening between ASEAN countries and China and the problems of the Northeastern Asian area. Because I think the relations between Japan and China are quite separate and a different ball game altogether. And that one, I think, is much more difficult to handle. I think the ASEAN one is, in a way, easier because there is ASEAN. There is at least the potential for the 10 countries to do things together and iron out problems among themselves. The relationship between China and Japan could be just too confrontational, just two powerful countries facing each other. And then the question of the United States playing a role becomes very delicate. And I think that's actually much more, to me, much more something to be concerned about.
Yes, but don't you think that basically there are also some claimants to territories in the South China Sea? Some of these claimants hail from ASEAN, and that too is going to be a problem going forward.
But I think it's more manageable because there is ASEAN.
Right now we're just trying to de-escalate, the tensions. And as I said, quiet diplomacy is best employed. It's not negotiating on CNN and not negotiating through, megaphone diplomacy. And right now, it is a time where everybody has to step back, and we take it step by step. But I agree with Gang Wu. It's not at the same level as the disputes in Northeast Asia. The history is very different. And I think there may be some negotiations already going on between some of the disputing parties, you know.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Well, everybody acted in the South China Sea dispute recently, and everybody sort of had their missteps, and everybody, let me put it this way. So the question is, how do you step back? And I really don't think that the United States and China want to go to war over the South China Sea. I think that's one factor to remember. Secondly, I do not think China wants a bad relationship with ASEAN. That's the other important fact. So we will work towards some solution, difficult though it may be. And it will take a long time. You are not going to solve the problem overnight or in another year.
All right, the chat here is de-escalation, and that quiet, not megaphone diplomacy is key to this relationship. We'll take a pause. We'll come back to you in a while. Welcome back to Perspectives. Now, we're discussing U.S.-China relations at a very interesting time because both countries are going through leadership transitions. And, of course, a lot of people are looking at the United States and wondering if indeed Romney comes into power, and of course he's made no secret of his position on China, that, you know, he's going to maybe come down hard on China. The question is how that is going to change then the U.S. relationship with China. Can we expect that he is going to go into office on day one, assuming he wins, and slaps sanctions on China, or is this all pre-election talk? What do you think, Professor Friedberg?
I think overall there's a great deal of continuity in American policy towards China over the last 20 years. Whether it's been a Republican or a Democrat in office, we have our debates and people accuse one another of being soft on China or too hard on China. But in the end, the relationship, the policy that we've pursued has been fairly consistent. We've sought to engage China economically, diplomatically, and in other ways. And at the same time, we've been working steadily to maintain a balance of power in the region that's conducive to stability and peace.
So you don't think that the Republicans are going to change tack? I mean, he's made it very clear that he's going to punish those who trade and cheat. I mean, he's made no secret of, you know, where he thinks China is coming from.
But I don't think that that's dramatically different than what the current administration is saying. The president was in Ohio 2 days ago announcing a trade action against China.
So, but again, it's been said that he's merely responding to criticisms that he's been too soft on China, hence, you know, the latest actions in the trade cases to the WTO on Chinese car parts.
Right.
You know,
yes, Prof. Chan.
Lian, the thing is that we know what is election rhetoric, and things are said on the campaign trail. And I have spoken to Chinese diplomats. They are fully aware of this. They say election talk. So that, you know, we all understand what the political cycle brings in the United States. So we should look at these statements over time and see where actually it leads. And what they said, I think, I can say this because I'm not involved, and now I'm no longer the ambassador in the United States. But, you know, a lot of this is election talk.
Prof. Wang, what do you think? I mean, what about China then? We know that it's going through a once-in-a-decade, you know, leadership change as well. I mean, and of course, I mean, it's evident to all that, you know, the one time more. What does this mean for this relationship then?
My own impression is that the Chinese policy towards the United States has also been very consistent. They've been holding firm to the idea that good relations in the United States is absolutely essential for China, particularly at this stage. But I think what is interesting also is to see that the question of how to deal with China, and the debates within China about how precisely to handle particular issues where United States and China relations come into the fore, I think that has been much more difficult to gauge. But I think on the whole, the issue is, as I understand it, is a question of saying, who are the people in America who are more likely to be pro-China? And they actually, curiously enough, become more and more enamored of your businessmen. in that sense, they're very torn about that. They're really, on the whole, happier with American businesses and their investments and their trading relationships, which they have found very useful for China, and less certain about how the working classes and the people towards the left of the Democrat side of the party, how these people will actually think about China. So there's a little contradiction somewhere. So I'm not quite sure how they understand it today, but I know that they have consistently watched for that. Where the American businessmen are likely to change their attitudes to China, to them is quite important because of the economic relationship.
Mm-hmm. At the time I left the United States, I was picking up that American business was not defending China the way they did in the past, mainly because they found some difficulties in doing business in China, and that the frustration led them to
I think that's something the Chinese will watch.
To step back from defending or pushing China for China the way they have before.
That's a change, and I think it's quite significant. And aside from the question of election rhetoric and the specific policies, I do think it's the case that the economic relationship between the United States and China is increasingly a source of friction, not only of cohesion.
Mm-hmm. I think this friction is part of the competition cooperation paradigm. What is significant is that China doesn't have a counter value system or ideology to export. So therefore, there is no room for that kind of clash.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that China should be worried, given the fact that, U.S. businesses and businessmen are not viewing the country so kindly today. But, I mean, moving forward, I mean, what do you think this tipping point is going to be? I mean, if the U.S. sees, China getting richer and stronger and not sort of moving or evolving towards political liberalization, and is that what is going to turn the relationship into something which is darker?
Political liberalization, I think as long as the Chinese system is working for the Chinese people, Chinese leadership would be quite comfortable.
But, I mean, isn't that the waiting game here? Isn't that what America wants to see? I mean, it is counting on the fact that China is going to be more liberal and hopefully move towards a democracy in time, given its financial development. And the Chinese, meantime, are thinking perhaps, if they hang in there long enough, that the wheels of history are going to turn in their favor. I mean, isn't that the game at the moment?
I'm not sure that the Chinese think that the Americans worry too much about political liberalization of China today as compared with, say, a decade or two ago. And I think that is something that the Chinese are quite content with. I think much more important to them is the economic relationship. I really think that they think that can spill over. If that goes wrong, then the politics of it, if the politics then takes over, it becomes much more serious. But as long as the economic one is profitable to everybody and healthy, signs of greater and greater cooperation, I think they're not too worried about the other side.
Would you agree that it's economics first and politics second?
Oh, definitely. But look, when China becomes a great power that, I do not know whether it will overtake the United States or when, but in terms of the economy, yes, but there are so many dimensions to power. But the United States has to respect a great power, its peer rival. You can't just try to mold it or shape it. I think the Chinese know that, and they're very confident about it. And now we understand political systems, change and move differently. I imagine after Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States would realize after the recent experience that it's very difficult to change the culture and political systems of countries, that it just comes out slightly different. And China, too, on its own part, is changing. It's changing because there are economic changes. The economic changes the Chinese want, in fact, will engender and create political changes that will carry the economics. So change is happening in China too. And I think it's more likely that you will find China and the United States consulting with each other much more. Not not because they are G2, because China doesn't want that. But it's a way of just, getting things sorted out.
Professor Friedberg, what do you think? I mean, will they sort it out this way?
I think in the long run, the relationship between the United States and China will be improved to the extent that China's political system evolves in a more liberal direction. You asked before about the mix of competitive and cooperative elements in the relationship. My own view is that if China continues to grow richer and stronger, but its political system does not evolve, in other words, it maintains an authoritarian one-party system, then the competitive aspects of the relationship are going to expand and the cooperative ones are going to diminish. In the long run, I think the best hope for a stable relationship between the United States and China, but also between China and its neighbors, is the liberalization of China's domestic political system. Unfortunately, that's not on the horizon at the moment, and in contrast to what many people believed, say 20 years ago at the end of the Cold War, economic growth and development has not brought political liberalization rapidly in its train. I think ultimately it will, but it's going to take a while, and it's the interim period that is potentially very dangerous.
Well, quick last word because we're running out of time. So in response to Professor Friedberg, in the long run, is it going to be contingent on political liberalization in China? That's going to ensure a stable relationship with the U.S. That's what the U.S. is looking for. Prof. Wang.
I think the Chinese themselves want to change towards a more liberal system, but they're also very realistic. They don't want to rush it. They don't want to cause great disorder within the China while doing it. But I think the people on the whole are moving in that direction. They want it, and the leaders know that. And there's a lot of debate going on right now. It's a question of when and how not to do it without destroying the Communist Party. These are the sort of reservations that the leaders have, but they want it. No
Quick last word, Prof. Chan.
You know, I sometimes wonder whether two suns can shine in one heaven. I think, you know, Shakespeare asked that, but I think I read what Hillary Clinton said in China, you know, which is, can we find a new answer to the old question? How can a rising power and an established power work things out? And the United States wants a new answer, and I think China wants a new answer. In other words, they should avoid the history of the past.
Right, very well put. Two suns, can they shine in one heaven? That's it for us here from the Marina Bay Financial Center. I want to wrap up our discussion here on Perspectives. I'd like to thank my panel as well. Thank you, Ambassador Chan Heng-chi, Professor Wang Gungwu, Dr. Aaron Friedberg, and Ambassador Riaz Khan. They're all here as participants in the Singapore Global Dialogue. Now, both the U.S. and China have downplayed their rivalry. U.S. officials have said their pivot to Asia is not a response to any particular country, and China has reiterated its commitment to a peaceful rise. And yet talk in the media and with each country's domestic political sphere tells a different story. Throughout history, relations between dominant states and rising ones have never been easy. How should we in Asia navigate our future as these two powers compete for pole position in our region? We hope you found our discussion thought-provoking, and remember, we want you to shape the next episode of Perspectives. Keep writing and connecting with us by leaving your comments on our website, channelnewsasia.com/perspectives, or you can tweet us. I'm Leanne Pegg. Till our next edition of Perspectives on November 4th, thanks for joining us.